Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. This is exciting to be able to talk about Joel's book. And even though everyone here already knows Joel and all of his good work, I just wanted to give a nice proper introduction and for people who might watch this and people who trickle in later and who watch it later. So thank you again, Joel, for doing this. As you all know, Joel is a nationally recognized expert on energy law and policy. He is the co-author of a widely adopted textbook on energy law. It's called Energy Economics and the Environment. And now he is the author of this book, Advanced Introduction to Renewable Energy. He's authored numerous books, book chapters, treatises, and law review articles on electric utility regulation and on clean and renewable energy topics. His scholarship has appeared in journals at Harvard, UCLA, Duke, Notre Dame, George Washington, Utah, Fordham, Illinois, BU Wake Forest, UC Davis, and William and Mary. He has been a distinguished energy law scholar for 2019 at Vermont Law School. And in recognition of his contributions and scholarship at Richmond Law, he was also named the inaugural Austin Owen Research Fellow from 2013 to 2018. His article, Residential Renewable Energy, by whom, was honored as one of the top 4 environmental law articles of 2011. And he was the University of Richmond's Distinguished Educator for 2010-2011. So with that background information, I will hand things over to Joel and let him start talking about his new book.
That's great. Thanks, Allison. Let me give a little bit of context here for all of you, particularly students who are coming to this talk. We are intending to showcase not just this book, but the books of other faculty who have books who are in the works. I'm looking at you, Professor Lane and Professor Spalding and Professor Tate. And so this is meant to be the first in a series of talks about the books that faculty members do and introducing you to the substance of them. And we'll do a little bit of commerce while we're at it. As I mentioned, the link for purchasing the book from Amazon is up in the chat if you want to see it. But I'm going to share the screen and start talking about the book itself. Hang on a second. All right, can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Great. So this book is really a first in its field. It's meant to be a clear, concise, and accessible discussion of a very, very complex subject, that is the laws and policies about renewable energy and its place in the global energy transition. And it's meant to explain and analyze the laws and policies that are guiding nations around the world in their transitions to more renewable energy. And one of the things I want to make sure you all know at the outset is that this is not a book that is simply about the laws and policies of the United States. In fact, when I was contacted to publish this book, I was told explicitly that you're not a homer for the United States here. You have to draw your examples and your discussion from laws and policies from around the world. And what's interesting there is I wasn't really given a whole lot of clarity about what that exactly meant. And so you'll see as we go along that what I did was pick examples of laws and policies from European nations, from Asian nations, from South American nations. And usually I looked for a law or a policy that was either illustrative of the concept I was trying to write about, or it was a particularly successful type of program. And I'll point that out as we get there. It's meant to be valuable to a very broad audience. It is for students, for professors, for practicing lawyers, for people who are making policy in this space, and for anybody who just wants to pick up the book and learn more about this important subject. So one thing you'll see as we go along is that there were a number of restrictions that I had to deal with as I was creating this book. The book is part of something called the Advanced Introduction Series from Edward Elgar Publishing. So unlike the books that the other faculty members are putting out, where they're writing the book and going to a publisher to see if the publisher might be interested in that book, they came to me. And they came to me and said, you're an expert in this field. We need a book that is an advanced introduction to renewable energy. And I said, what's that? And they said, our series on advanced introductions is introductions to major fields of law by the leading scholars in the world. And these books are meant to do two different things at the same time. They are meant to pinpoint the essential principles of the law in the field, and at the same time, get you to think critically about how you might learn more about a specific law in your nation. The format is roughly 150 to 200 pages long. So for you as students, for you as professors, it's clearly not a treatise. And one of the things that I had to work at very hard during the development of the book was just exactly how I balanced how much content I put in and how much I left out for the reader who might be tempted to go learn about their own renewable energy law in their own nation later on. But one thing was made very clear to me at the outset, and Professor Tate and I were talking about this before we came on. This series is meant not only to be an introduction, but also to reflect the current policy conversation and not just simply introduce the subject. And I said, oh, okay, so I'm going to write a book that's 200 pages long. I've got to cover the waterfront in terms of what the law is. And oh, by the way, I've got to critique the law as I'm going along. I thought that was really challenging. And I knew that was going to be a big challenge as I went along. You see here that I've taken a snapshot of 3 of the other books in the series. These are books on US environmental law. They sent me an exemplar book on international environmental law. So I pretty much knew what the content of an individual book in this series would look like. And the people who are authoring these books, the 2 people who are authoring the US environmental law book, have decades of experience back to the 1970s. They've been environmental and energy regulators at the state and federal level. The person who wrote the global administrative law book, I looked him up. He was a professor and a judge in Italy for decades. And so it was a little daunting to think about bringing my own expertise to this and demonstrating that I had expertise in renewable energy, but also working within the constraints of getting this particular book done. So one thing that was readily apparent right off the bat was that the audience for this book was going to be very broad and very different constituencies. One thing that was obvious right from the beginning was that it might be 300 level undergraduate students using it as a textbook in a course. It might be somebody picking it up who wanted to know about renewable energy because they might want to influence what happens at a subnational or national level. It might be a practicing lawyer who wanted it as a desk reference. It might be a law professor using it as a text. It might be someone who is tasked with making law today in renewable energy in a state or federal government who might want this to understand the context in which they operate. So I thought about that for a while. And then I realized that that put 2 constraints on any of these books. The first one is it couldn't possibly be a treatise. It had to be an introduction to all of the major laws and policies, but it also had to assume that the reader had absolutely no prior knowledge in this subject. And in fact, I had to assume that the person I was dealing with didn't have the benefit of the first-year leg class at the University of Richmond School of Law. I had to assume that they weren't necessarily a lawyer at all. It might just be somebody who was interested in renewable energy and wanted to read more about the subject. So one constraint that put on me right from the beginning was that I had to assume that the person who was picking this book up didn't even know much about renewable energy other than it has something to do with the sun and the wind. And so I knew that I was going to have to spend a chapter, and you'll see that in a moment, literally explaining what the renewable energy resources are and how they're different from one another. One thing that was obvious from how the publisher was reaching out to me was that this had to be useful to readers around the world and not just in the United States. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how to structure a book where you could pick it up and read about policy differences, and you could be anywhere around the world. And I suspect this book has probably been purchased at places around the world. And that introduced a certain limitation on me. I couldn't assume, for example, that the person I was dealing with as a reader was in a common law nation that had an Anglo-American tradition. I couldn't assume that somebody who was reading this book operated in a nation like this one that has an active tradition of national and subnational public utility regulation. I couldn't even assume that I was dealing with a nation that had a lot of renewable energy deployment. This could be somebody picking this book up in Africa, in a nation that is just trying to get solar energy now off the grid. So I had to think about making this as broad and as accessible as possible. So why this book? Why did they come to me? First of all, solar, wind, and other forms of renewables are growing in importance around the world. And nations are recognizing that renewable energy is even more important to meet our obligation to address climate change and to make electricity, transportation, and buildings cleaner. Now let's stop right there for a second. My expertise is in the electric grid, and that is the use of renewable electricity to make the electric grid in this nation and in Europe and Asia cleaner. I have less expertise in the transportation and building sector, but there's obviously a lot of discussion about having electric vehicles that use electricity and might work in connection with somebody charging at home and using a solar panel to charge a battery to make that a cleaner form of transportation. So I had to think about the balance among different sectors of the economy that I was going to address here. But the one thing that hung over this book from the beginning, and I made sure to address it very early on, is why the world itself is transitioning to clean energy, why the future mix of the energy and the future energy mix in the world is likely to feature more renewables. And that is the pressing need to do something about climate change. What also is important to understand, and I made this clear right at the beginning, is that these laws and policies are developing rapidly. So it's important to understand them and how they're evolving. There are a lot of data points, statistics about renewable energy, ways that laws exist right now in the US and Europe that are in a constant state of flux. So I didn't really know. One of the things I really did not know from the beginning was what the lifespan of this book was likely to be. So I figured, I talked to a bunch of folks. I think, Karina, I think you and I had this conversation. And I seem to remember that I settled on a 3 to 5 year window for when this book was likely to be current. And what that meant was I didn't want to make definitive statements about how laws and how data were going to change in the next couple of years without knowing that it probably was going to go in that direction. So here's a good example of that. There is far more renewable energy now than there was even a decade ago, and it's rapidly becoming less expensive. And as you can see from the graphic here, renewable energy dominates how we are generating electricity. Solar and wind farms are being built in this country and elsewhere, and we have not built a new coal-fired power plant in this nation in a very long time. But more importantly, there are people who believe that we can meet a very large share of the world's demand for electricity from renewables by the year 2050, if not sooner. And that works hand in hand with the idea of what people have called the energy transition. And that is, we need to move even more quickly and deploy even more renewable energy to meet the climate goals that we have set out as an international community in the Paris Agreement. But as you can see from the graphic on the left here, there are subnational jurisdictions, states in the United States, that have very ambitious climate goals. Here in Virginia, we have a statute, the Virginia Clean Economy Act, that calls for the state's utilities to be 100% renewable by 2045 and 2050. And so when going back to the idea that there had to be some form of critique in this book, one thing that was readily apparent from the beginning was that the critique of any law or any policy that I was going to bring to the table had to be framed in light of this need for the quicker transition to clean energy. There are other considerations here. The idea of energy justice has started to take center stage in discussions, and I mentioned that in the book. Certainly, there are economic and social and political objectives other than moving more quickly on the energy transition, but I give them less attention than the idea of moving more quickly to deal with climate change. Let's think about all the various topics that are addressed in the book. And what I'm going to wind up doing in a few moments is walking you through the different chapters of the book to show you what I actually covered. But I sat down with a clean sheet of paper at the beginning and thought, okay, what do people want to know? And the very first thing I was asked to do was provide a very detailed outline, partially to show my bona fides in the renewable energy field, but also to get a sense of how this book might be structured. And so I put together a roughly 5-page outline of a number of different chapters, and that didn't really change all that much after we got started. I was pretty careful to try to think up all the possible questions that a reader might have, and then I just wrote them down and thought, how do I best organize them? And I'll talk a little bit about my organization in a second. Think about all these different questions. What is renewable energy? Remember, I've assumed my reader knows nothing about what an renewable energy resource is. And by the way, there is actual disagreement among scholars, among policymakers about what is and what is not a renewable energy resource. So it's not as simple as just saying, here are the resources. There are people who, it's very controversial, by the way, to discuss whether burning something, biomass, is or is not renewable energy. Europe now has a definition that's aimed at this particular topic. And so simply just to say, what is renewable energy was not really all that easy, but I knew I had to do that up front. How much of each type of renewable energy do we have now? How much do we expect to have in the future? I knew, because it's an important topic around the world, that I was going to have to talk about the government support programs that support renewables and what they are. But also I wanted to address the person who comes to this and says, I want to put solar panels on my roof, and what's involved in that? And what laws am I going to confront if I try to do that? How does renewable energy fit into the electric grid or off of it in nations that don't have the sort of network that we do? And who's responsible for overseeing that? How are projects financed? And project finance can be multi-million-dollar finance for a solar farm, or it could be a tax credit for me to install solar panels here on my roof at my home. And so I had to cover both of those really in some depth. And then finally, would having some form of carbon pricing help or hurt renewable energy? It's a pretty daunting list. And one thing that was really challenging right at the outset was to try to organize all of these questions and all of these answers in a way that would make logical sense to a reader. But one thing I did know was that there are over 100 countries that have some form of renewable energy policies in place right now. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the requirements of this series was that I had to draw on examples from all over the world and explain the variability among national and subnational policies. So, for example, there's one policy called Feedin Tariff that well over 100 countries have, but no nation does it the same way as any other nation. And so I had to explain the variability among policies around the world. That was a task that occupied me for the better part of a couple of months. That was a pretty deep dive in terms of the research. So let me get into, Allison, I figure I'm just going to go through all the way to the end and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Is that okay?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, good. So the chapters were meant to tackle all of the aspects of renewable energy development, including legal, financial, and technology concerns. One thing that made this book different from the one that I was sent on international environmental law was that I wanted the reader to be able to understand the laws that govern renewable energy, but also the broader context in which the resources are being developed. So I wanted to explain what the individual resources were and how they've been developed throughout the world, explain the laws and policies, and also highlight where I could the strengths and weaknesses of the laws and policies, and this is where my own viewpoints come in, and spotlight how they're changing. And the idea here was that it was meant to prompt discussion and prompt people to think about having more policies to drive even more growth. All right, so what I'm going to do now is just dive into the chapters after the introductory chapter that handle all of the individual questions that we've been posing here. One of the features of every single book in this series is that there is an introductory chapter that tells you exactly what the next chapters are going to be about. So if you read the introduction, you're getting a précis of some sort about all of the chapters that are to follow. In the very first chapter after the introduction, I talked about what the renewable energy resources are. Started right off the bat by talking about what renewable energy is. I suspected for any reader that would probably be the entry point to the discussion. And that involved not only talking about the wide variety of different definitions of renewable energy, but also the distinction of renewable energy from non-renewable resources. And renewable energy resources are those that can be replenished after use. So we're talking about solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, and biomass. And one thing I wrote in the book was that you might think of nuclear energy as something that is renewable. Most people don't, and it's because the fuel itself has to be dug up from the ground. And so it makes it more like a fossil fuel in that regard. So I don't talk about nuclear energy at all in the book. There are individual sections in chapter 2 where I talk about each resource in turn, how much we have now, where it is, where it's been deployed. I talk about individual projects in many different nations and how much of each one of these is planned. And the reason for doing it resource by resource is that a lot of the laws and policies are different depending on what you're talking about. The laws that govern hydropower are very different from those that govern solar. And so we have that sort of differentiation in the laws of each resource at present. We also have very different technical characteristics for where resources can go. Wind power needs to go where we have windy locations. In the United States, onshore wind works best down the spine of the Rocky Mountains, and there are plenty of offshore locations that are very promising for wind. There's also plenty of offshore wind in Europe, which is way ahead of us in terms of developing that and making it work. And so this chapter is not only here's what individual resources are, but also where they've been deployed and at what scale. The next chapter is probably the longest one in the book, if I recall correctly, and that is the government support policies for renewable energy. I made a basic decision here not to cover everything that a government does to promote renewables right here in this chapter. From the beginning, I decided to have a chapter that was about subnational regulators like public utility commissions in this country and what they do to promote renewable energy. And I also have a chapter, it's chapter 4, that is about what national regulators do. And national electricity regulators have a big role to play in renewables, but we don't tend to think about what they do as direct support policies from a government. And so even though this chapter is the longest one, there's still plenty of other room to talk about what a government does to promote renewables. As you can see from the graphic on the right here, even in the electricity sector, there are a wide variety of different government support policies for renewable energy. We call it, in the classroom, we call it the toolbox. I'm not the first person to use that metaphor, and there are many, 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 many different ways that governments have tried to promote having more. Mandatory targets, requirements that utilities purchase renewable electricity under some sort of fixed price contract. One mechanism that's becoming popular now is having auctions or other forms of tender-driven procurement schemes. Access to electricity markets, which I talk more about in chapter 4, and then other mechanisms that aren't directly about buying energy, like loans and grants and loan guarantees to people who are, to developers who are going to make renewable electricity. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't going to spend a lot of time talking about the transportation and building sector, although I mention it from time to time. Here, I decided to have one long section of this chapter devoted to renewables in transportation. So if you wanted to learn about how governments are promoting electric vehicles and how that's related to renewable energy, you would find it in this chapter. There is a wide variety of these half dozen sorts of policies that support renewables, and there are different approaches in different nations. You can see here on the right that European nations are different from one another in how they have gone about promoting how generators of renewable electricity get paid. And what's even more interesting about this is that nations are evolving over time. Germany originally had something called a feed-in tariff, which was literally a fixed amount that was paid to you if you made renewable electricity. It has now moved to something that's more like a procurement auction structure. And so here, this gave me a perfect opportunity to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. For example, a feed-in tariff does a really good job of guaranteeing payment to somebody who's making renewable electricity, but it might shoot too high. In Germany and Spain, it shot a little bit too high. It got too much. It was too successful. And that meant that other people who consume electricity were disadvantaged. So the government has switched over more to the procurement auction that they can control a little bit more directly. So this became a very long chapter because it talked about the variety of approaches, the strengths and weaknesses of each, and how nations are transforming from one type of approach to another. I spent a lot of time doing research in international sources that listed the over 100 nations that had a feed-in tariff, or the over 100 now nations that have auctions and other procurement mechanisms, and trying to get my arms around how I could describe the commonalities in the various approaches without spending 500 pages doing it. In chapter 4, I talked about a subject that would be familiar to anybody who's taken an energy law with me, and that is how national electricity regulators affect renewable energy projects. And they have a central role in administering the grids and, in our nation, markets for electricity. And there's a wide variety of different models of national electricity regulators throughout the world. Some of them are independent from central government control, as here, but some of them are literally run by the government and don't have the sort of electricity markets that we do here. And so I had to talk a lot about a subject variously called liberalization or restructuring, and that is changing the electric grid to be more market driven. Here, we've done as anybody who's ever listened to one of my presentations knows, we've been partially successful at that, but not completely so. But in other nations, there's central government control of this. The Chinese control of the grid by a combination of government regulators and private corporations looks nothing like what we do. But in both cases, the structure of national electricity regulation has a lot to do with how we get renewables on the grid. So too, do the nations like Australia and the United States and the UK that have public utility commissions, state and provincial regulatory bodies that govern public utilities. So here I had to talk about these subnational regulators, and they have a big role to play in all of this. My students in energy law learned that public utility commissions are involved in siting and licensing of new projects, and they have policies that promote renewable energy like net metering, which is the ability to sell your excess electricity from solar panels back to the grid. And here too, I had to spend a fair amount of time talking about how these policies are evolving. Some states are replacing net metering at your full retail rate with other forms of valuing the electricity you send back. Got to chapter 6, and here I'm going to put in a plug for the University of Richmond. This chapter was about private sector financing for utility scale and for small scale projects. We talk about utility scale, we mean something like a big solar farm. We talk about small scale, we mean something like the panels on my house. And there are numerous different models and structures here. The one that I'm demonstrating with the graphics here is something called a power purchase agreement. And the University of Richmond, the Weinstein Center, has a solar array on the top of the building that's pictured here. And it was the very first solar installation in Virginia to use Virginia's new form of this power purchase agreement. A lot of these financing mechanisms are sanctioned by positive law, but a number of them are done through the tax code. And those of you who have talked to me about what classes you should take over the next couple of years know that I say take federal income tax because the tax code is integral to the development of renewable energy in this country. A lot of what happens with project development is tied to the availability of tax incentives. And so this chapter is about private sector financing. I talk about how you could lease solar panels if you didn't have the money to pay cash to buy panels outright. But I also talk about these incredibly sophisticated forms of financing for large renewable energy projects, the power purchase agreement being only one of them. I got to chapter 7 and chapter 8, and I had a lot of things left to talk about that didn't by themselves warrant an individual chapter in their own right. And so what I did was I put them together under broader umbrellas. Here I called chapter 7 Systems Promoting Voluntary Adoption of Renewables. And this allowed me to talk about everything that is going on that is not a governmental mandate. But it's a lot of different kinds of projects, a lot of different kinds of mechanisms, that some of which don't always go together. The only thing they really have in common is that they are voluntary in their nature. So some of you may have heard me talk about community solar or other community energy projects that involve a number of people who live in the same area to come together to make a renewable energy project from which they will all benefit. But there are a number of other voluntary systems out there. There are multinational corporations that have committed to corporate procurement of renewable electricity. And this is something that is happening much more rapidly throughout the world. In fact, 1 hour before I came on this call, I saw that another Fortune 500 firm is aiming to procure more renewable electricity. And so I put all of this together in a chapter that was about systems promoting voluntary renewable energy. In chapter 8, I covered, albeit somewhat briefly, a wide variety of other laws and regulations that are not directly about promoting renewables, but can have an impact on renewable energy development. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with the use of the Endangered Species Act in this country to try to stop wind farms from being built. But there are also a large number of other types of laws that have affected renewable energy projects, state and local land use laws, private property laws, constitutional law here in this country, and then a long line of European decisions by the Court of Justice of the European Union that have affected development of renewable energy there. And so I discuss all of this in chapter 8 with the proviso up front that this is about laws that have an impact on renewable energy, but obviously are not meant to directly stimulate its development. And I got to the last chapter, and I figured it's time to talk about carbon pricing schemes here and in Europe and in Canada that are aimed to replace all of their, scholars have debated for years whether we should replace everything that I talked about in chapter 3 with some more simple, more administratively simple form of carbon pricing. And so I talk about those schemes. I talk about the ones in Canada, the ones in Europe, and talk about the arguments about whether they would be superior to existing support schemes for renewable energy. Obviously, in a book that's about the existing laws that promote renewables, I'm not going to come out in the last chapter and say we should do away with all of those laws immediately, but I do have to acknowledge that debate. So I did that in this chapter. And then I closed out with a bunch of observations about where I thought support mechanisms might be going and some thoughts about the futures of renewables. So with that, let me conclude, and I'll just say it's a very exciting time to be learning about all of this. This is a subject that's becoming much more important very quickly, but as I finished the book, I realized that what I was hoping to do was take any reader from a position of not knowing much about this at all to having a really in-depth look at the laws that regulate and are promoting renewable energy. So obviously, I encourage everybody to dive into this and learn more about renewable energy and its place in the global energy transition. I've put the link to purchase the book in the chat, but I'll stop right there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have. We're in the chat so far. All right, questions that anybody might have. Hi, Jack. Allison, go ahead.
Well, first of all, just thank you for doing this. It's so interesting to hear about your thought process and hear about the way that you organized the book and thought about mapping it out. One question I just wanted to sort of hear more about from you is thinking about, you mentioned at the beginning and then at the end, thinking about where your reader is at, right? How much knowledge you can assume and what you can't assume, even for a legal reader, right? We all work in fields that, I don't know as much about renewable energy as I should, and a lot of people don't know about as much about trust laws. I think they should, right? So it's difficult. Then you have people who are not even legal readers. So I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk about sort of how you imagine sort of your typical reader and how you modulate your writing for that person.
I think that's a good question. I think from the beginning, I imagined the prototypical reader was going to be somebody like a first-year law student in this country, or let's say a 300 level undergraduate student. Right? So Tanner, Brittany, Kyle, I kind of imagined it would be you. And I imagined that there would be three different places. Law professors always do things in three, don't we? Three different places where it might be problematic if I didn't do a good job explaining it. The first one was because the individual governmental support schemes are so complicated. Renewable portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs, the auction mechanisms themselves are complicated. If I didn't do a good job of introducing the subject, literally just providing an introduction to the subject, it would be near impossible to take it in a more substantive and technical direction. Right? The second problem I wrestled with a lot was how much detail to provide and how much detail to leave out. And it was a constant battle. And basically what I was always thinking about was, I need to give somebody like our three students here enough that they've heard about every conceivable permutation of the particular support scheme or particular national form of regulation that they could encounter. And so that means I had to say, you might be dealing with clients who are based in Asia, where the national electricity regulator doesn't look like the one here. And so I tried to err on the side of giving as many details as I could about the various flavors of laws, flavors of policies, flavors of institutional structures. And I figured that the reader would probably view this as an introduction and then would use this as a jumping off point to go learn about their individual law. So at one point, for example, I mentioned the structure of Zambia's electricity law. And I used that one because it was particularly clear in terms of how it represented a particular model of how national regulators do their thing. Karina, what you got?
Yeah, well, listening to you, by the way, thanks. I also really, really enjoyed this. Listening to you made me wonder, is this book, and I'm asking a personal question here, But I'm asking you, I'm not asking the one you think I am. It's not about me. It's actually about my husband. So given the fact that you've written this sort of with, perhaps students in mind, or someone that doesn't know so much, what about somebody like John, my husband, who's, been doing energy law, renewable energy stuff for 20 years? Is that, I'm thinking, like, should I be buying the book for him? And you should be like, yes, you should buy it for everyone.
Well, you should buy it for everyone. That's the obvious answer.
But I'm just sort of wondering, would someone who is deep in this field feel that this is more like confirmation of what they know, or do you think there's new stuff in there for them too, or what do you think about that?
Now, I'm gonna answer that in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
And that is, at the same time that I was writing something for essentially the very interested student, and by the way, that student could be somewhere in the United States or Europe or Asia, and anybody who's got enough of a command of English to read a book like this would be doing this. I had to think about, for somebody like John, I had to think about credibility. And
you have a lot of it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are aspects of this that I know very, very well. And there are aspects of this that I don't know all that well. I don't do project finance. So I talk some about it in my energy law courses, but I don't do that day in and day out. So what I did was I ran individual chapters and parts of chapters by 5 colleagues in the US and in Europe and in Asia. I said, oh, am I doing something wrong here? Am I not being credible? So what this does for somebody like John is it's meant to be a bit of a desk reference. If there's something that he hasn't seen before in his own practice, he might be able to pick it up here. But also, it's meant to be a broader discussion of the themes that are going on in this field right now. And so from the beginning, they said to me, you've got to be credible in terms of introducing your readers to the cross-cutting themes that are going on. And that might be something that a practitioner doesn't always see. So that's a long-winded way of saying, go buy the book for him.
No, I'm totally going to buy the book for him. I mean, I was thinking of even, people who are generally doing this work are doing it domestically. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from the comparative stuff that you talked about. The other question that I have, since I'm off mute, is how long did it take you to write this?
It took me a while.
Yeah, well, books do. But I mean, when did they approach you? And then, when did you have to get them a manuscript, or did you do it?
Yeah, I'll divide it. Yeah, good point. I'll divide that into 4 parts. It took me about a month to a month and a half to get a detailed outline. It took me a year and a half to research and put everything together to the point where I figured I had everything in the right place. I made a lot of these judgments about this goes here instead of here. I had to do a lot of that. There was a lot of, net metering goes under the subnational regulator part of it, because that's where people would expect to see it, at least in this country. It took me about 6 months to write it. And it took me,
that's fast.
It took me about 6. I had the benefit of having one semester where I had some fairly concentrated time to do it. And I also had the benefit of spending the beginning of one summer doing it. The editing process was actually quicker than I expected. It took about 3 or 4 months in editing. And they had copy reading stages. One thing I knew that I was going to have to provide, I said this to Allison before we came on, was I made a 20-page glossary of acronyms and explanations. And that sits at the end of the book. They actually, they didn't ask for that, but I knew I had to do something like that. Jack, what do you got?
So this may or may not be something that you covered directly in the book, but I'm just curious because I see all sorts of different articles and stories and this and that. And I just sort of want to know from someone who's really studied this, if you had $1 million to invest, what form of renewable energy would you invest in terms of making money, not saving the planet, making money? And this is partly, it's not just simply because I want to know how to make money. It's because I'm wondering, like, where are the economic incentives currently aligned? In other words, and are they appropriately aligned for what we might prefer? I know they're not appropriately aligned for what we prefer, but I'm just.
All right, this lets me get into something I actually didn't even mention in the presentation. I spent one part of the chapter talking about energy storage and all of the different policies that nations are bringing to the table to make storage a reality. The electric grid in this country is the only supply chain that we have that has no viable form of consistent, lengthy storage. Even the natural gas system has it. Certainly, the food system does, but the electric grid does not. So if I had money today to put into this, I'm actually putting into a combination of different resources. What I'm probably going to do here in this country is build solar plus storage and try to monetize that.
What's solar plus storage?
In other words, I have a solar farm with batteries right next door.
Oh, plus storage. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
In other words, I have a solar farm with batteries right next door. And one of the things I've been talking to with my students in energy law for the last 2 weeks is something called aggregation, which is putting a wide variety of different kinds of resources together, an electric vehicle and a solar panel, and even a diesel generator. It doesn't have to be something that's always good for the planet. And putting all that together and making that a resource that's controllable and useful to the electric grid. But that's space age stuff that's a ways off. If I'm trying to make money right now, I'd say solar plus storage.
Okay. All right.
You got $1 million for me?
I don't, but I'm just
Also,
sort of.
Jack was a former, Jack, is it not true? You used to be an investment. You used to be an investor.
Commodity trading. And
a commodity trader.
Storage
I just want that to be known.
Storage is a huge issue in pricing. That's why the futures markets are different for things like corn versus, securities in any event. So.
And my students right now in energy law are doing a writing assignment that has to do with the regulations that the Virginia State Corporation Commission put in place to encourage energy storage. So it's something that's coming, and it's coming at scale, and it's coming at scale relatively quickly, but there are a lot of bugs to be worked out before solar, or certainly a combination of solar plus storage, is monetized in various markets. All right, Tanner or Brittany, what do you want to know?
I just bought the book, so I'll get back to you.
Well, good. I appreciate that.
I was wondering, you said you were looking at kind of the structure of countries all around the world. What does a research process for that look like? And you mentioned, I think it was, 1.5 years of research.
Oh, yeah.
Were you concerned about things potentially changing at any time, having to go back and update? Like, what does that look like? How are you tracking that information?
That's a great question. That was certainly one of the hardest things I had to do. Obviously, in this country, I'm not quite so worried about it because I'm keeping track of developments pretty consistently. Elsewhere was a pretty different story. It's easy to do research in Europe. it's easy to read European sources and keep on top of that. And I had to fight the tendency to just make this a US and Europe book, right? So if I was doing research elsewhere and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't wrong when the book went to publication, I had to do two things. The first one was I had to be absolutely sure that my research was current. And the second thing I had to do was I had to come back at the end, as I did many, many times with student research assistants, looking to see whether a law had changed or something had happened. And in fact, there was a major change to US renewable energy law during the time that the book was being edited. And I literally had to go to the editors and say, I need to change this part of this subchapter because it's not current anymore. And if I had not done that, the book would have been not as credible as it could have been. And Karina, I was thinking about your question about how a practitioner would view this. It's a snapshot in time. And so it runs the risk of, I'm not going to be updating it. There's no update process for this. But what that meant was if I provided statistical data, I had to provide some sort of qualifier and say, this is the amount of solar we have in 2021. Mm-hmm. Knowing that there would be more in 2022 and 2023. I just had to do that. And that was very important. Janice, what do you think?
Hey, Joel, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
All right. Sorry, I'm off camera. I don't have any questions at this time. I just want to say that this is incredible. The work that you've done is incredible. I am bowled over by this presentation and cannot wait to read this book. Despite that, energy law is not an area that I'd normally dive into. I will purchase this, absolutely. So thanks so much for providing this talk for us today, Joel.
Thank you, I appreciate that. One thing I was thinking about, Allison, you were asking about basically effectively who this was really pitched at, because you could say that people could pick this up and use this. Karina, I was actually thinking at some level that this would be more useful for the first year associate who's going to work with John than to John himself. I mean, John himself is likely to know almost everything that's in this book, but the new lawyer might pick this up and come up to speed relatively quickly. And I was thinking about that person as somebody who would really, really benefit from this. You've decided maybe you didn't take energy law in law school, and maybe you now are in a practice that's either transactional or regulatory in energy law. We certainly have them now here in Richmond. You might be inclined to pick this up and get up to speed very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I definitely thought about that person when I was doing this, as somebody who might be very interested in this. One thing I should mention, is I did something of a literature search. We do this all the time when we're writing law review articles to see what else is out there. And there isn't anything. There's no book that introduces the reader to all of these different issues and all of these different programs and all of these different cross-cutting conversations in this sort of coherent and short form way. And there are longer books. There's a course book on renewable energy law that a friend of mine at Arizona State has put out, but it's a course book and it relies heavily on longer form materials. If you were teaching a law school class in renewable energy, his book and my book would be natural companions, but they're not the same thing at all. They're meant to get people up to speed very, very quickly.
Right. Well, this is fantastic. We're a little past time, but this has been it's been great just to hear not only about the substance of the book, but sort of the process and all the things that you've had to think through. So hearing about it both from both sides are great. Okay, just before we say thank you and sign off, in 5 words or less, what's something that you wish you'd known before you started writing the book that you know now?
I wish I'd known it was going to take me 3 years.
Okay,
I-
that's fair.
It's because part of it, I wish I had known how difficult the length constraint was going to be.
Sure.
I really wish I had known that. It wouldn't have prevented me from doing this. It was a labor of love, obviously, but I wish I had known how hard that constraint was going to be.
Yeah. Well, we're all glad that you persisted. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Fantastic to hear about the book, and thanks for sharing it with all of us.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Bye.